Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participant, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Future Thinking of UNDRR Webinar 1, Disaster Risk Reduction, Reflection of the Past and Present. My name is Afifa Tajratul Muawana from UNDRR Alliance, and I will be the MC for today's webinar. We sincerely thank you for joining us. May I remind all participants to kindly keep your mic muted. If you would like to raise questions or comments, kindly type in Q&A box. The moderator will call on the participant. Kindly be informed that this webinar will be recorded for the communication purposes. This webinar is proudly organized by UNESCO Regional Science Bureau for Asia and Pacific, Jakarta, Indonesia, UNDRR Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, Bangkok, Thailand, UNDP Accelerator Lab Indonesia, UNDRR Alliance, and supported by Japanese Fund Interest. This webinar consists with two main sessions. The first session is reflection of the past and the present, and second session is on the future thinking on disaster risk reduction. We are honored and lucky to have together with us Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta, Chief of UNDRR Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, Dr. Hans, Officer in Charge, UNESCO Jakarta Regional Science Bureau for Asia and Pacific, and Mrs. Sophie, Kemkhadze, Deputy Resident Representative UNDP Indonesia, as well as our five prominent speakers, Professor Rajib, Professor Keio, Mr. Bas Liers, Professor Riel Miller, Ms. Nurul Sri Rahatining Tias, and our moderator, Mrs. Jekulin Lipi from UNMGCY, and Dr. Sachi Suzuki from UNESCO, and distinguished participant. We are pleased to invite Dr. Hans to provide opening remarks through a video message.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, participants, a very warm welcome to this first webinar on the Future Thinking Disaster Risk Reduction Initiative, which includes a series of online dialogues with experts and future literacy laboratory sessions aiming at equipping youth and young professionals with the ability to strategically use futures for decision-making and to leverage the collective intelligence and the frontiers thinking of youth and young professionals for new ideas and new concepts and frameworks for disaster risk reduction and resiliency by 2045. This is a collaborative initiative among UNESCO, UNDRR, UNDP's Accelerators Lab, and the UNSPIRE Alliance. It will continue until the next global platform for disaster risk reduction in 2022. This first webinar is also supported by UNESCO Japan Funds and Trust. We need a different way of thinking in this uncertain time. The shocks brought by the COVID-19 pandemic have generated a great deal of reflection, anxiety, and also action. The pandemic in systems and processes now shapes how we respond to disaster, how we view disaster risk reduction, and what resiliency means to us. Several aspects that have made it difficult for us to adequately prepare ourselves for these uncertainties are limited information, the inability to effectively and efficiently respond to arising situations, and the failure to see the urgency of these growing complex challenges. In addition, the ability of people to immediately adapt to the situation leads to a problem of a more difficult situation as a whole. This global shock arising from a sudden disruptive force, the pandemic, and other disasters caused by natural hazards and climate-induced disasters as well. These are simultaneously happening. They propel us to question ourselves, how could we have navigated this volatility better? Could our current knowledge and understanding help reduce the risk of today's unprecedented disasters? We need to ask these questions, and we need to look to the futures for answers. What if we try to imagine and utilize futures to help us make decisions for disaster risk reduction and resilience? We do that, we can open the possibility that a different logic might inform the functioning and perception and choice. We welcome difference and uncertainty. We shape our disaster risk reduction and our resilience through diversification, through exploration, and through emergence. So in that way, several questions arise. How do we get ready for the future? What needs to be changed? What are the interventions and choices and decisions that are needed as priorities if in the future we're to prepare better for disasters and reduce our exposure to risk? What are the opportunities that need to be captured and replicated? What are the transformative choices and decisions that have to be made in order to achieve the future we want? Present-day disaster risk reduction strategies and activities are based on the accumulation of everyday perceptions, choices, and decisions made in the past. So that's before the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pandemic, which is now upon us, shows us that decisions and actions that are based on pre-pandemic normal may no longer be suitable for us to face the uncertainties of the future we now face. And that results in a vulnerable and a fragile society facing a plethora of disasters that we are simply not equipped for. The year 2045 marks more than 50 years after the first World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction held in Yokohama, Japan in 1994. And 30 years after the last World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which was the third World Conference held in Sendai, Japan in 2005. The year 2045 is 24 years from now. By then, the current youth and young professionals will be between 41 and 64 years old. And we can expect that many of them will be in positions of leadership. We're honored to have with us for today's event two experts on the topic, Professor Rajib Shaw and Professor Keio Takeya, who are familiar with the Yokohama, Hyogo, and Sendai negotiations. We're also fortunate to be able to hear more about the concept of futures literacy from colleagues at UNESCO headquarters, Dr. Riel Miller, and we're going to learn about foresight thinking from our colleagues in the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, as well as about new ways of thinking from the UNDP Accelerator Lab through Mr. Baseleurs. So lots of excellent capacities with us today to get us thinking in new ways. I'm confident that this webinar will provide valuable information and serve as a good start to the Disaster Risk Reduction Future Thinking Initiative. With that, I wish all of you a productive and inspiring and innovative discussion here today. I thank you for your attention.
That was wonderful opening remarks from Dr. Hans. Next, we are pleased to invite Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta to provide the opening introduction. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction and also great remarks by my predecessors, which nicely lay out the work that we're going to do together. It's certainly a great pleasure for me to be part of this webinar, and I want really to thank my colleagues in UNESCO, UNDP, and UNSPIRE for their partnerships and leadership in this. We at the UNDRR were very pleased when we were asked by the UNESCO colleagues to join in this endeavor and to be part of this very important project, the Future Literacy Project, for a couple of reasons, fundamentally. First, because of course it's focused on disaster risk reduction. And secondly, because the underpinning idea of use the future is quite an interesting one and certainly very powerful. In co-organizing this webinar, we felt that it was really important to look at the present and the past state of the global thinking and practice around disaster risk reductions. And the goal for today really is to give the participant, the young participants, an understanding, a baseline understanding on how we got here. And so we could call it probably today's webinar as a sort of prospective retrospective. And for this, of course, as we've just been mentioned by Hans, we have the great pleasure of having two distinguished speakers with us today. who knows a lot. Professor Rajib and Professor Takeya are world-leading experts. They have a lot of wisdom and knowledge to share in disaster risk reductions, both in terms of the concepts as well as the way the practice has evolved around it. Since the audience of this webinar is wide, it's kind of diverse, I think that would be helpful maybe to start with a very small point and allow me to offer a simple explanation around DRR. The goal of disaster risk reductions, as also enshrined clearly in the Sendai framework, is to prevent disasters. It may sound like a very bold statement, but yes, you heard me right, preventing disasters from occurring in the first place. And some of you, of course, may wonder, Marco, how can you really prevent a storm from happening or an earthquake? And in fact, these are important questions because they do allow us to clarify the fact that an earthquake or a storm are not disasters. They are other hazards. In other words, they are, in simple terms, they can be considered as dangers which only becomes disasters when or if they impact on vulnerable people and assets. A home, if a home is built to be earthquake-proof, it does significantly reduces the risk of collapsing and therefore causing casualties. And that's why it's important to build resilient homes in order to reduce or eliminate their vulnerability. The same is also for storms. And one of the reasons why they are becoming stronger and more frequent is because of climate change. So if we can work really hard and harder to stop global warming, we can reduce the appearance of such extreme storms and thus reduce the hazards, of course, from them. The same story can be said by on floods and many other hazards. So understanding these risks and how they are created, and then the planning against them and the implementing measures to reduce or even eliminate these risks is what disaster risk reduction is really about. The most important evolution to occur in this field over the last decades has been the growing realizations that countries, in order to address this challenge, they can't just invest in responding more quickly and more effectively to disasters. This is very important, but actually what their realization is that we need to do much more to invest in prevention, in preventing disasters. And it's not only about governments, it's about us as citizens demanding for disaster risk reductions, try to behave in a way that doesn't increase disaster risk. It requires the work of civil society at large, private sector, you name it. It's really a collective commitment and a collective endeavor that everybody needs to play within their own share. This is what leads, and is the foundation of the culture of prevention, which is really at the heart of disaster risk reduction. And the reason why it has been always termed as the culture of prevention, because it's not a competency that resides in one sector or the others or in one stakeholder of the others. It's really the foundation of our society. That's why it needs to be culture in that sense. And cultures cannot be built through a collective participation today. And in that sense, that's why it becomes so critical for protecting development. And of course, in this region, in the Asia-Pacific region, you know it very well. This is very disaster-prone, and the question of prevention is really high on the agenda, and certainly will be even higher in the years to come. Now, it is obvious for everybody that if poor countries are constantly trying to rebuild and recover from disaster, it would be really impossible for them to achieve the sustainable development goals. And it's not only about countries, it can also be specific communities within even more fortunate countries, because we know that the diversity and in fact that the gap that exists between rich and poor countries is actually increasing, and therefore making certain segments of society particularly vulnerable even in countries which are, as I said, a bit more fortunate. Now, disasters, of course, are becoming costlier and costlier, also because of the growing drivers, so-called the drivers of disaster risk, meaning what causes the creation of disaster risk to start with. And this includes many aspects, but such as like unplanned organizations, environmental degradation, climate change, just to mention the few. Now, these drivers of risk are often an outcome of what has been called failed development, which is fundamentally a development that is not truly sustainable. Is a development practices that instead of reducing disaster risk, they actually create disaster risk, sometimes due to short-term gains. Now, what we do know also is that these risks do not materialize overnight, but in fact, they are the result of years and decades of unsound development practices. And that is why reducing disaster risk is really a cross-generational endeavor, and one that requires a long-term view into the future and a very sound understanding of the consequences of what we do now. Where we see the impact the most is at the local level. The majority of disasters are so-called small-scale events that often do not make the news, but still devastate the livelihoods of those specific communities and individuals, even families. Now, it is at this level, at the local level, that innovative and tailored solutions need and can be found, and when youth can play a fundamental role in shaping the evolution of their communities to become resilient. That is why engaging youth in this endeavor is just essential, and why I believe that the future thinking on the UNDRR project is very, very important for youth, for practitioners, so that we can really think together on how we can ensure that in the future, disasters do not prevent our societies to thrive and set us back. So I really want to thank you again for being here today, and I hope that you will find this webinar interesting and informative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marco, for insightful opening remarks. We are pleased to invite Mrs. Sophie Kemkhadze to open the session. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and very good afternoon to you all. Selamat siang. Very warm welcome to this first webinar for Futures of Thinking in Disaster Risk Reduction, which is jointly brought to you as a result of collaboration between UNESCO, UNDRR, UNSPIRE Alliance, and UNDP's very own Accelerator Labs. I want to acknowledge Dr. Hans Thulstrup, UNESCO Jakarta Regional Science Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, and Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta, Chief UNDRR Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. And by the way, many thanks for your inspiring and insightful remarks. Also, warm greetings to Professor Rajib and to Professor Keio, to distinguished panel members, to my colleagues from UNDP, and to you all who are connected to this webinar today. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has given us time to reflect and rethink our approaches to various development scenarios. Before the pandemic hit us, for most people, perhaps disaster was something that they would hear about, they would read about in the newspaper, see online or in the news. But as a pandemic affects all of us, we finally realize that each disaster brings suffering for thousands of people, sometimes for millions of people. These people are directly affected and they suffer considerable loss. Sometimes they even lose their loved ones. And then there are many years often of struggling, of going back to normal after the disaster. So helping disaster hit communities get back on track has always been one of UNDP's core areas of work. For us, building community resilience to disasters and helping people, families, and communities recover from disasters is a key in our partnerships for a country's sustainable development. But the question is, Have we come to terms with the new concept of disaster resilience in light of the pandemic? Ladies and gentlemen, it has been almost 30 years, as Marco mentioned, since the first World Conference on Natural Disasters, which was held in Yokohama, and over half a decade since the last World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai. Of course, we know that anticipatory action and preparedness have always played a strong role in building resilience. But to succeed, we need to anticipate the unknown even more. This is where futures thinking can help. It helps us better anticipate and identify different future possibilities and helps to navigate the challenges and uncertainties of today. It allows us to adopt new ways of thinking to mitigate future crises and disasters. We believe that future thinking will better equip us to achieve the SDGs as we work to ensure no one is left behind. Ladies and gentlemen, how many of you sometimes wish to have cue cards of what lies ahead? In times of uncertainty, we want to have this ability to see through the future. But the truth is, nothing can prepare us more than data and knowledge. I am a trained mathematician. For decades, I have built my career in development based on solving complex challenges by thinking critically and logically, using available data and information. And speaking from experience, I can assure you that this is a much more exciting and rewarding process than having magic cue cards in your pocket. So, understanding the future is not just about building future vision or ideas, which is important, by the way, but it must also include a robust and calculative analysis of our present conditions and surroundings. And one thing that I want to say here is that no one is better prepared and in better position to lead the analysis on future thinking than the youth. Youth and young professionals of today are and will be in leading positions and will be the leading agents in the future. So I am very glad to see that we are joined by many enthusiastic young men and women and young professionals this afternoon. We should also use the future thinking as an opportunity to build a more inclusive society by considering the impact of disasters on women, on people with disabilities, and other groups. Our past research shows that women and children are nearly 14 times more likely to die during disasters. It's a painful reality, I know, but we should use this data as an opportunity to imbue gender responsive and inclusive policies and context into our futures thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenges of our future cannot be imagined or solved alone. We need stronger coalitions and ways to bring the ideas of the future into real decisions today. This is why we at UNDP are proud of the work we are doing with our accelerator labs. This once again shows that innovations and the new ways of thinking are the cornerstone of our work. Equally, we value the partnership which we have formed with various stakeholders and our partners from UNESCO, UNDRR, and UNSPIRE Alliance, and allow me to thank them for collaboration and partnership. I look forward to hearing from our panelists about how we can be better prepared and ensure our response to future events will be far more informed. I wish you a good discussion. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you for your awesome opening remarks, Mrs. Sophie. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to announce a certificate to attendance will only be given to those who requested. Please fill in the form of attendance and answer the questions pertaining to the presenter's talk. There will be evaluation of the answer. Only those who seriously answer to question will be granted the certificate. So we will now have a group photo session. Before we process, may I invite all participants to turn on your video camera for a group photo. Mr. Marco, please, to turn on your video camera for a group photo. Okay, thank you very much. The photo will be taken on the country. Please be ready and smile. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. You can turn off your camera. Next, we will enter the first session, Reflection of the Past and the Present, that will be moderated by Mrs. Jekulin Lipi Saikia from UNMGCY. Ms. Jekulin, the time is yours.
Thank you so much. So welcome everyone to the first session of today's webinar. So over the past decades, we know the disaster risk has increased drastically, and it has also grown in shapes and size with every passing year. So let me give you some statistics on this. So according to the UNDRR, the Human Cost of Disaster report between 2000 to 2019, there are recorded 7,300 major disasters, and we had an economic loss of $3 trillion US, plus it has more of impact all over the world. So, but there is a sharp increase in the economic loss, which is compared to the 1980 and 1999. So, and this difference has rise due to related to the climate-related extreme events. Now, if we imagine like the time when we get the actual impact count of the COVID-19 pandemic, it would be huge. So during this same period, government and experts have been thinking about how to address this growing disasters through global agreements and frameworks to not only reduce the disaster impact, but prevent them from future occurring. So if we are to imagine what would be the future which is free of disaster, we must first understand what happened in the past, our history, and the thinking that we went through in shaping the current world. So we are very lucky to have us our two distinguished speakers who has been part of framing the global frameworks and propelled in the evolution of disaster risk reduction. So today we have our first distinguished speakers, Professor Rajib Shaw. So he is a professor in Graduate School of Media and Governance of Keio University, Japan. He is the co-founder of a Delhi-based social entrepreneur startup, Resilient Innovation Knowledge Academy. And he's a co-chair of two Japanese-based non-governmental agencies, Seeds Asia and CWS Japan. He's also the co-chair of Asia Pacific Science Technology Academic Advisory Group, and he has worked on multiple research papers, and he has published many books in the field of environment, climate change, and disaster management. So we welcome you here, sir. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. My sincere gratitude and thanks to all the co-organizers, UNESCO, UNDRR, UNDP, and the most important, the UInspire Alliance, for organizing such a fascinating webinar. And I understand that it will be a series of webinars. Then what a fascinating concept this is. Like, you are thinking about 2045, while rest of the like the global community was thinking about 2030. I think this type of futuristic thinking can only come from when we have the involvement of the youth. And that reminds me, like in Yokohama, 1994, that was actually the year I came to Japan, and I started my life in Japan from Yokohama. And after 5 months, I came to Japan. This Yokohama conference was held, and that was in May in 1994. So I was just thinking while reading the concept note that when we were participating in Yokohama conference, did we think about what will be 24 years later, 27 years later? Possibly not. But now, with the great vision, this youth group here, you are thinking about 24, 25, much beyond in the future. I think that's a very, very futuristic vision, which we need to actually inculcate among ourselves and to enhance. And that will be possibly guiding some of the actions which we take now, and how it is actually reflected in future. So once again, my congratulations to all the organizing team for bringing up this excellent theme. So what I would like to do, possibly a little bit of overview of what we experienced and some of the milestone. Actually, last year I published this paper. This was a 30-year summary. I give this website also, you can download this paper. This was in International Journal of Disaster Risk Science, IJDRS. So there I tried to review 30 years of science and technology innovation and how it actually evolved from 1990 to 2020. I will come back to this, that why I started in 1990. So this was like the 30 years, we did it last year. So, you know, this 1984, that time there was the World Conference on Earthquake Engineering, and it was held in San Francisco. And that time, the president of US National Science Academy, Frank Press, actually gave this idea that we should have some international decade for disaster-related issue. But if you see here, I quote his statement here, I believe there is a great need, and all this word, but what he proposed was international decade of hazard reduction. And all of us, we understand now that we don't reduce hazard. But when it started, because it was an earthquake engineering conference, that time our mindset was more focusing on the hazard response. So all this, our thinking were on the hazard related thing. Based on that, 1987, there was the UN General Assembly resolution and the establishment of International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, which is IDNDR. And here also I highlighted that that time the name was Natural Disaster Reduction. And we don't use anymore the term natural disaster. We use natural hazard. And we always say that, and as Marco also pointed out, that yes, the hazard is natural, but the disasters is possibly the consequence. So, so that's the reason actually. This is why I put this 1990, because this was the first global decade for disaster-related activity. And that's how the name IDNDR actually stayed from 1990 to 1999. I have been very fortunate to be involved at the very sort of early stage of IDNDR. And 1991 was the time when there was the Science Technology Committee, which was formed which actually supports different types of science technology. And there is a connotation behind that. Some of you who work on the field of climate change might know that in 1988, maybe before many of you were born, was the time when IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was established. 1988. And that time, that between 1980s, early 90s, there has been lots of discussion that how science can make some sort of impact, not just having the academic paper, but science policy interface. And that was actually the main reason why the IPCC was formed. And here also, when IDNDR was formed, at the very beginning, there was some argument that, yes, we need science and science-based policy intervention. And that's the reason 1991 Science Technology Committee, and then there has been some formal meeting in 1993, and then that actually brought this 1994 Yokohama conference. I will come back to the Yokohama conference a little bit later. But on the science technology part, this 2000 onward, then this Science Technology Committee, which was earlier STC, has been changed to Science Technology Advisory Group at the global level. And many of you are aware that in the regional level, we have formed 2015 after the Sendai conference, the Asia Science Technology Advisory Group, and then in 2019, it has been changed to Asia Pacific. And we are very happy that UNSPIRE, Rahama is here. So SEAM is part of this Asia Pacific Science Technology Advisory Group. Now, I saw this particular diagram, very interesting, in the concept note, which all of you have seen, that where we are now, we are thinking about 2045 and all the numbering you have given, and like 50 years from the first World Conference and so on. So there have been actually many different disasters in between, which triggered lots of this type of international, I will say, advocacy, international awareness, and so on. And one of the major disaster, which actually in the late 1980s was 1988 Spitak earthquake in Armenia. And that time Armenia was under Soviet Russia, and it's almost the decentralized, like the, how do we call, the fragmentation of Soviet Russia was just about to start. But 1988, the Spitak earthquake was one of the major earthquake which triggered lots of discussion among these different groups. And you will possibly identify, like I started with 1987 earthquake engineering. So when you talk about the disasters, the earthquake related hazard were one of the major trigger actually to start many of this type of global initiatives at the beginning. Of course, nowadays, there are like the geological hazards, but also the climate-related hazards, which are the daily or the seasonal hazards becoming also very, very important. But the trigger were quite a bit the major earthquakes. The same thing, 1995, Kobe, and so on. So you see here that 1990 to 1999 was the IDNDR, and then it came the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, which is ISDR. So a few highlight of IDNDR was like, it was actually the first time when there was a national focal point was established. So each of the country were asked to establish or identify, not establish, rather identify a focal ministry who will work with the this international decade program. And it actually varies. In some of the countries, it was planning ministry. Some of the countries, it was Ministry of Internal Affairs. Some of the countries who had possibly the Home Affairs. So it was more like in countries like, say, for example, in India, it was Ministry of Agriculture, because Ministry of Agriculture was holding the disaster management and so on. So it actually varies from country to country. And also there was a very strong advocacy, like the pre-disaster preparedness, and all these numbers like $1 in prevention saves $7 in response. So these things actually started, like why pre-disaster preparedness matters, and then also the science technology part. So when we had this 1994 was one of the landmark of this particular decade, when we had this Yokohama conference. And many of you possibly have seen the Yokohama strategy and action plan for a safer world. And that was the first global document which had which has been, it's not, of course, not a binding document, but it has been agreed with the participants, and it has principles, action plan, and some sort of guidelines. And one very important part of this Yokohama action plan was there was a very strong role of the civil society, the non-government organization, and other partners. So now we see the stakeholders partnership is very common. But I think that Yokohama conference actually put that particular seed of the stakeholder partnership, recognizing the importance of the civil society very strongly. And then also the early warning system, the Mekong River Commission, they started the typhoon early warning system, then the Pacific Ocean early warning system started. So there were like different types of need for the early warning system started. And then I also participated in this particular initiative, which was called Radius, and that was on the urban risk reduction. That time we were talking about the importance of the urban risk. That time still, now we say that more people live in the urban area than the rural area, but that time it was more the rural population than the urban population, but there was an increasing trend of the urbanization. So we had our first project, and we had 9 cities globally, and there were many different types of stakeholders. And it was very important that we created a scenario of a city's earthquake, but then that scenario was written by a journalist for a person, for a common people to understand. So we started communicating with all different types of other stakeholders, and that is possibly one of the key aspects of the first international decade. Then the initial years of the UNISDR, you know that 22nd December 1999, when the Secretariat International Strategy for Disaster Reduction was formed. But again, the name was disaster reduction, not disaster risk reduction. And one of the major aspects was at the initial year was the involvement of 2002, which was the Johannesburg Plan of Action. Many of you know that the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was organized in Johannesburg in 2002. So this was 10 years after the 1992 Rio Summit, and there was a very clear link which was established between the sustainable development and the disaster risk reduction. And I will say, I may be wrong, but at least to me, in my knowledge, I see that this is possibly the first global attempt to link the disaster risk reduction and the sustainable development in the formal UN document. And that was this WSSD, where the sum of elements of the Yokohama strategy were incorporated. And then in 2003, the General Assembly decision was taken that there will be a world conference to be held in Kobe in Japan, in Hyogo rather, in 2000. That was in 2003, and the conference was held in 2005. So 2005, of course, before 2005, our Indonesian colleagues remember it very vividly that in 2004, December, 26th was the day of this Indian Ocean tsunami, and that actually put lots of emphasis on the early warning system and its importance, because this tsunami was one of the disasters possibly where the largest number of nationalities were affected in one single disasters. And then, of course, there were some other resolutions of the UN General Assembly. And in 2007, the first global platform was held in Geneva. And again, I was fortunate to attend the first global platform. And I know that next year in Bali, in Indonesia, we'll host the next global platform. Yes, it's almost now 15 years then, from 2007. So it's a journey of 15 years of the global platform that will be next year. So I think when we talked about the Hyogo framework, a couple of things I would like to highlight, that we started thinking about risk reduction than disaster reduction. Again, the national platforms got more emphasis, especially many of the countries, they have the coordinating mechanism with not only just one ministry, a few ministries together. The community-based disaster risk reduction got quite strongly highlighted, because possibly one of the nature of the Kobe earthquake, where we saw that in spite of like all the preparedness in the emergency response, 98%, I will say 99.2% of the victims were rescued by the local communities, by their neighbors. So it actually highlights the importance of the community-based issue. There were two major campaigns in this time. One was the Safe School and Safe Hospital. Now we have this disaster resilient infrastructure initiative. But I think that time, like the schools and the hospitals, like the vital infrastructure or vital social infrastructure, I think how we can make them safer. So the Safe School and Safe Hospital campaign, and also another major campaign which UNDRR started, that time UNISDR started, was the Resilient City. I'd also like to highlight another important point, what we see in this 2005 onward, that this financing and the governance part. There were many countries who started establishing their disaster management law. So we have a legal instrument in most of the countries, and 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This 5 year, at least I can say from the Asia Pacific region, most of the countries actually initiated their disaster management law as a legal document, legal instrument. And so that was one of the key achievements. And also the pre-disaster financing, like the development budget, how you can incorporate the risk reduction issues in the development budget. I think that was very, very important. I won't go into the details of this. So you know that the World Economic Forum, this risk outlook, but this year, if you see this year, like we all know that there have been increasing like the green boxes, which are the environment related risk, have been in the top 3, 4, 5, both in terms of likelihood and impact. But there are two issues which coming apart from the infectious disease, which is obvious, which came this year report. It is the largest impact. But these two parts, one is the digital power concentration and the digital inequality. These two have high risk of the likelihood. So when we think about why I'm showing this one, that when you think about the future, I think some of the new issues will come up, which we were possibly not thinking 10 years before, 20 years before, or 30 years before. So I think more we depend on the digital devices like this type of Zoom, and it has positive side, but also there are new increasing risk which possibly we need to think about. So how we can make this risk reduction in a more inclusive approach, I think that's one of the key issue. We did 2019 in the global platform, we launched this particular report. Some of you are aware that 30 innovations for DRR. And why I am showing this one, that we did a survey that what are the top 10 innovation in last 30 years. So, and then there were around 100 No, more than that. Around 300 people actually, they responded in this poll, and it was a global poll. And there were all different groups of people. There were students, science technology group, NGOs, some government official, private sector, limited media people, and so on. And this was the ranking. So they say that the community-based disaster risk reduction is regarded as one of the innovation, hazard mapping, remote sensing and GIS, then vulnerability assessment, risk insurance, national platform. So these were, so we divided actually the innovation. Some are the actual process, like the approaches, which are written A, and some are the product. So we found that when you talk about the innovation in disaster risk reduction, it's not only just the product, but the process, the new approaches are also equally important. Again, my intention of highlighting this one was possibly it will be very interesting to see 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, what are the key new innovations which are coming up, and how do we rank those innovations. And I was really surprised to see this particular result. And we have also an academic paper on that one, that the community-based concept, and which is not an innovation actually, like we all know, but to recognize it as a tool. And there are so many guidelines developed, there are so many different projects which were developed, and it becomes one of the very high innovation for disaster risk reduction. And one of the major credit actually goes to this during international decade, 1990 to 1999, and the early stage of 2000, where there were lots of focus has been done on this community-based disaster risk reduction. My last slide here, that when you talk about the future, this is just a thought that I think when you talk about the governance, I put it a little bit, I usually use this particular framework we call the GET framework, GET, governance, education, and technology. And I think in future, we need to talk about more adaptive governance, living with uncertainties, becoming new normal, inclusive governance, systemic risk. So these are possibly the things, but these are, I will say, maybe the near future, maybe next 5 years. I can't imagine what will be the governance structure, maybe 20 years down the line, but at least the immediate priorities, we need to address this one. For the education part, I think citizen science becoming more popular, experiential learning with virtual reality or augmented reality, like you can actually feel. I think these technologies are getting more popular. So when you talk about disaster education, this will be more used. Then the higher education part, like where I am based in the university, I think that we are gradually shifting to this incubation-based higher education, where we have different disciplines, you have different idea, and it is not just a teaching and learning type of higher education, but it's more germinating new idea. And this is still a new trend, but I hope that 5 years to 10 years down the line, this will be quite common. On the technology side, all of you are experts on different types of new and emerging technology. And I say that today's emerging technology is tomorrow's essential technology. So what we say, the current emerging technology, which will be essential technologies maybe after 5 years. But what is lacking very much is still, I guess, the social innovation in this DRR field. Still, we are possibly going to more on the high-tech part, but how we can actually reduce, focus more on the social innovation and the entrepreneurship development, like DRR as an career opportunity, not to go and work for somewhere, but you create job opportunity using disaster risk reduction and you be an entrepreneur. And this is actually one of my future hope and future goal. With that, I will end here. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much for shedding the light towards the history of this evolution of disaster management, and also showing us what could be the emerging issues in future. So thank you so much, sir. It's always a pleasure hearing from you. So let me invite our next speaker, who is Professor Keio Takaya. So he is the Distinguished Technical Advisor on disaster risk reduction of Japan International Cooperation Agency. He was the main member of Japanese government negotiating team for the UN Sendai framework for 2015 to 2030 and made a big contribution which made shift change from humanitarian issue to developing issue and also established Build Back Better. So we are very privileged to have you us today, sir. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction. Because of the time is already delay, I try to make very speedy, but this is for the youth and young professional webinar. So I try to make a presentation, give more clear image, impactful, or rather simplify the issue in order to so easily understand. So what do you image from disaster? So this is one action. For example, I'm sorry. Like this. This is already. Oh, I'm sorry. Just this is just image of disaster or hazard. Already Rajib said. It is said that usually disaster happen. So we start response and recovery and reconstruction and mitigation and prevention for the future and combine as Build Back Better and preparedness for the next disaster happen. So usually crisis and damage control separated. Crisis and damage control and risk reduction, but in the hazard and exposure overlapped areas risk, and it is like this kind of figure. It is please image the differences between hazard and vulnerability or exposure. And for this case, you already found that disaster in the bottom is not a disaster. This is hazard, and the hazard will in response, if response is not appropriate, hazard will change to disaster. This is a situation, but the world trend of disaster risk reduction is already Rajib-san said about the international decade for natural disaster. Wording is still natural disaster here, and change to Yokohama outcome from the international strategy for disaster reduction. We set up from 48 action from Yokohama to Hyogo framework. And then MDG and climate change Kyoto protocol is ongoing in the another movement. Then we face to 2015 year, 2015. This is a very much epoch-making year for us because the first Sendai framework for DRR is agreed, and the SDG agreed, and the Paris Agreement agreed. So you can see until 2030, all the three big international initiatives move on simultaneously as a synchronize each other. And from this point of view, one more question. Can you guess the name of famous natural disaster which caused the biggest mortality for Northern European countries after the World War II? After the World War II, for the Northern European country, the biggest mortality happened Sumatra tsunami. Could you imagine? So this is Sumatra tsunami, earthquake and tsunami, the first internet era's mega disaster, which gave the reality by the disaster and gave huge impact to the people through the internet, like this mobile phone, camera, and movie. And so many countries thought if early warning were there, our young surfer could survive. Because of the Northern European countries, within the Christmas vacation, many people enjoying surfing in Sri Lanka or Maldives and another country and died. So that's the biggest mortality happened in natural disaster after the World War II for the Northern European country. But local economy will be or war completely destroyed. Even early warning could secure human lives. This is a big issue for us. So is this enough for MDG or sustainable development goals? This is a very fundamental, dilemma for us. So as Rajib-san said, just before establishing Hyogo framework, just 4 months before, Sumatra tsunami happened and many people died. So Hyogo framework was very much influenced by this incident. So you can see in the red zone, this is a priority for action. In the priority for action, already in the UN meeting, rise up early warning, enhance the early warning. So this is, of course, we can secure the human lives. But local economy will be completely destroyed. So early warning is minimum, how to say, survival issue, but not enough issue for the sustainable development goals for the society or millennium development or economical development. We cannot prevent the tsunami, but we can modify to reduce the exposure of the people living more appropriate within the land use plan and so on. So from that point, the Japanese government concerned to the Sendai framework, as we hosted 3 times in the UNDRR meeting, first Yokohama, second Hyogo, and the third for Sendai. How can we shift or graduate disaster risk reduction from humanitarian issue to development issue? And then how can we make appropriate fundamental conditions for SDG by Sendai framework? And one more thing, how can we make appropriate fundamental conditions for Paris Agreement, climate change issue by Sendai framework? So I will explain the example of number 1, from humanitarian to development or SDGs linkage. Development usually obstruct this development obstructed by disasters for poor people living in the vulnerable area like this, and so easily damaged and floating for and lose livelihood and everything, and then live more vulnerable area because they lost everything. So sometimes on the street like this, street children and like this, and then it is much easier to be damaged with a pandemic or health condition and then for the next. And so deflation spiral of poverty and vulnerability. And then drop down to more serious issues. So far away from development plan of each countries, or far away from the Millennium Development Goals. And for example, response is very photogenic. And every news shows this kind of photo after the mega disaster happened. And people knows and cheer up heroic activity for the rescue. But the rescue is just after disaster and the damage happened. So development obstructed by the structure, by the disaster like this, usually your country's Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Development make image like normal development like image, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, our GDP must be growth, that's okay, no problem. We hope so. But in the reality, disaster happen, whether natural or man-made, disaster happen and the GDP will drop down, and recovery effort will be done with the donor and with the country. And the next, within a few years, next flood, for example, first landslide, next flood happened and many people die, and repeat again like this. So development obstructed by disasters. So how to fill this gap? This is the issue for us. Not for the humanitarian issue. Of course, humanitarian issue is minimal requirement, but we must look more for the future. So just before Sendai, we discussed, and the EU already make the seminar that UN World Conference for the UN conference that €1 can spend for disaster prevention can prevent future €4 to €7 disaster response or damage or recovery cost or opportunity, lost opportunity cost. That means disaster prevention investment are much cheaper than disaster damage. Of course, we cannot count human lives by money. Human life, this is just a direct and indirect cost. Solution is very simple. So by the holistic approach to reduce disaster risk and make investment for the future today. So based on this concept, this is a Hyogo Sendai framework. You can see priority for action. In the action, number 3 is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. So make today investment for the future resilient society. So this is a very basic concept, and also using I proposed everything about the Sendai framework during the spending 1 year in Geneva negotiation. We Japanese government proposed to use the word of investment, not the project cost or benefit. Investment has a positive wording feelings, which echo to sustainable development and climate change, and not the negative cost or benefit, but can create future condition. So this kind of wording is very important. And then number 3, how we can make appropriate fundamental conditions for Paris Agreement by Sendai framework. This looks like a little curious, but for the meteorological disaster like a flood, you can so easily understand. But the problem is coming. Question: what are the contents? We can talk about the contents and the moral hazard. If we did not streamline the discussion, the moral hazard will so easily happen. How do you think? What is the moral hazard for DRR from the context of climate change? Okay, let's go. I'm sorry. It is true that by the climate change, flood is increasing, and the frequency and the volume increasing so much like this. This is the Philippines, Manila, headquarters, capital. Japanese government, for not only Japan, but another country also, but the Japanese, as you know, Japan is very steep mountains and very flood-proof countries. So we government must define for the future. So Japanese government identify from the research the increasing portion by climate change will be 10 to 15% of original rainfall in Japan for 100 years level flat, 100 years or 200 years level flat. That's like this. Original rainfall volume is for example 300 million millimeter. The additional portion by the climate change effect is 10% to 15% only. So most of the development country did not made enough prevention and mitigation investment even for original level of rainfall, like a 3 years or 5 years flat or 10 years or 30 years. But when we talk about climate change, of course, we must count climate effect, 10% or 50%, that's okay. For Japan, we are now planning. But what is the, as I questioned, what is the moral hazard? So that means this is the reality, but how to avoid discussing as if like climate change effect looks like 100%, escaping from minimum investment for today's original flat, 90%. Do nothing, then do nothing for 90% and just only talk 10% issue is big Ben. So sometimes the situation is mislead, like just talking about the climate change. we cannot identify the downscaling the model, so we don't know the future rainfall and so on, but just 10 to 30% maximum. So you can prepare for original rainfall volume for 100 years. That means that we'll save for the future climate change effect within 50 years return period or something like that. But the moral hazard is like this situation. Can be so easily happen. So moral hazard risk, that means not to come to agree and do nothing. Then time will spend and lose opportunity for the disaster risk reduction for the future today. So this is a very serious discussion for us. So from this point of view, what is the solution to avoid moral hazard? Very simple. Respecting concept of common but differentiated responsibility for the climate change, of course, we know, and make it clear minimum responsibility of each state, country, in the guiding principle in para 19 in the Sendai framework, like this, guiding principle. Each state had the primary responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risk. So that means for this portion, original this portion, starting from here and reach to some extent, of course, climate change effect is always existing even in the 5 years return period flat, but still the primary responsibility had each state had a primary responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risk. So by this, we request every state, please do today's prevention investment for the future that will simultaneously save the human lives and assets for the future by the climate change, even so. But if you talk, we have no idea for forecast for the future rainfall by the climate change, and just a meeting discussions, spend and pass the time and do nothing. So that's one of the moral hazards for us. Okay, so enhance understanding of the Sendai framework for the audience. I will explain a little bit about this. As already I show this, but the priority action, we listed priority for 4. One is understanding disaster risk. Second is strengthening the disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. That's okay. Priority 3, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. So make clear, make the resilient society invest for disaster risk reduction. And the number 3 is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response. Of course, disaster will happen, we need response. And to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. That means, unfortunately, disaster happen. Use disaster as a trigger to make more strong and resilient society for the future. As a trigger. I do not want to say as a chance, as a trigger. Okay, so, but these priority for action has logical relationship within each other. For example, the investing for the UNDRR and preparedness build back better disaster happening here. This is a normal disaster management cycle. These cycle must be make the good governance led by the central government, because most of the budget coming from the central government. And government, state law or regulation coming from the government. So leadership and governance and management is very important. But how? The substance must be knowledge, evidence, science-based. So understanding disaster risk is coming from more scientifically, not the political intention oriented. So this is the structure of 4 actions. And also, this is the first time we put the target. We did not have the target in Yokohama and Hyogo, but we did made target in Sendai, because to combine with SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So we put 3 input target and 4 outcome target. So I will show structure more. looks like 3 input target is access to information and international cooperation and national and local strategy. This is enhanced. Every 3 input target must be enhanced. And then we get reduce the mortality and affected people, number of affected people, and damage to critical infrastructure, and reduce economic loss. So within these 3 outcome targets, you can see, as I always say, within the same stomach of economic loss. What means, if we want to reduce the mortality, that's a humanitarian issue. But if we reduce the economic loss and give the society more strong and could be protect more, so that is the combined to the sustainable development. And also countermeasure for mortality can be reduced by the early warning, but economic loss couldn't have been reduced by the early warning. So prevention investment is most important. So if we personally asked which is the most important target within the 7 in the Sendai method, I definitely say most important target is reduce the economic loss. So within the reducing the economic loss by the prevention investment, we can also reduce the mortality, can reduce the damage, affected people, can reduce the critical infrastructure damage. So reduce the economic loss, countermeasure to reduce the economic loss as a holistic approach, we can reduce. So, and one more thing, national and local strategies until 2020, not 2030. So that means the situation, let's go to the situation of achievement target today. So usually, this is a typical escape of DRR agency, Rajib said of the platform agency of the development, starting from stage 1, response-oriented. Stage 2, leadership for mainstream and pre-investment using the line ministry, cooperating with the line ministry. And stage 3 is a holistic approach for residual risk. Already investments are done and the remaining is just how to prepare for the future like this. So, but anyhow, response needed for COVID-19 these few years. So more the DRR agency who try to graduate from the response-oriented to mainstream to make the investment for the DRR. Unfortunately, COVID-19 had happened, and this is response-oriented activity is needed for the people. Okay. So then planning phase and implementation phase, I say, the Sendai framework is divided into 2 phases. One is 2015 to 2020. This is target E, national and local strategy by 2020. And using this local strategy and plan, we can make investment for 10 years and reduce the outcome target. So this is a very simple phasing. And we are now here. But unfortunately, situation is not enough to shift from the planning to implementation, need more effort, especially need to mobilize political leadership of each state. So this is the situation. So how to harmonize COVID-19 and a traditional DRR effort? So variation of risk of Sendai framework, it is already said that from natural hazard to man-made hazard, and the geological cause hazards like a macro earthquake and local flood or more micro landslide, and the meteorological cause hazards like a landslide and a cyclone and forest fire. And this is random happen. This kind of natural disaster will random happen, but already exists historical data, so we can do the probability analysis for the future. And so countermeasures are relatively identified, series of countermeasures to prevent. And on the other hand, health condition, including infrastructure, pandemic, and human error like a tech hazard. This is still incident issue, need more research. And countermeasures are relatively not identified one by one. Of course, you can so easily understand. So looking from vertical view of this fundamental condition, for example, for the flood case, as I already shown, this type of disaster and hazard, hazard will change to disaster like this. And you can so easily fundamental condition to increase or induce as cascaded hazard as a health condition or human errors within the such a bad circumstances of natural hazard. So easily happen. So we are now, JICA DRR group is doing continuous effort to reduce risk, mainly for natural disaster, to improve fundamental condition for the even including a pandemic and tech hazard and other cascaded disaster. So what are the difference between COVID-19 and a natural disaster, or not limited to natural, but here limited to natural disaster? As I said, like this, usually if the emergent, this is as I shown before, the crisis control and risk reduction, disaster management, risk reduction and management cycle. But how about the pandemic, emergency response, medical care, and hand wash and mask, social distance, and vaccine and herd immunity, and the medical system, social system, new normal life to prepare for the future pandemic? So in this case, there is a killer application for the COVID-19. It's my personal opinion, but it's simple. Vaccine and herd immunity. This is a killer application. If completed, the risk will dramatically reduce. On the other hand, for example, flood case, natural disaster, we make the levee, reservoir system and levee, and try to structure measure, and non-structure for upstream reforesting or appropriate land use plan, flood-proof lifestyle, flood forecasting, early warning, evacuation and insurance, and business continuity plan, and so on. Many menus. And control, protection, and prevention, or risk mitigation, avoidance, and transfer, and within the condition of each country, each area, each local prefecture, we must select best mix of these items, which fit to people's life, which fit to local economy, which fit to local state condition, and make safe and resilient society. So it's not so simple. We have no killer solution. There's a many mixture of the countermeasures. So from that point, for example, traditional DRR investment, big effort still needed for the future. For example, flood disaster case, usually uncontrolled inundation happen, we call flood. If controlled inundation to the appropriate area, we don't say flood. So this is a flood, but the risk reduction as a social system only can contribute to SDG, sustainable development. That means, for example, DRR investment for reservoir system in the upstream by the central government, and levy by the central government, and the retention area with land use regulation and controlled inundation by local government, by like this kind of, this is very much simplified, but anyhow, controlled inundation. And so leave no one behind. The keyword of the catchphrase of the SDG, we only can say leave no one behind because of like this kind of, how to say, social system, social prevention system, not a personal activity or personal effort. So this is a responsibility of government who agree to the Sendai framework. So from that point of view, sustainable development goals adopted in the red color zone is similar to, how to say, include Sendai framework indicator. Sendai framework target indicator are used for SDGs in the red zone. So we are very much similar. So biggest outcome of Sendai framework is made fundamental condition for SDGs and Paris Agreement and merge everything for sustainable development. Like this. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Just 28 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. So allow me to put a question to you. So the question is, what would be your idea about what should have after the Sendai framework ends in 2030?
Hi. We decided that we will make phasing and establish the local DRR plan and make investment. So very simple. We must straight go on the defined route of this. So nowadays we need remaining some country make the local disaster risk reduction strategy and plan and implement it. Very simple. So that's my clear answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamil. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure hearing from you. So moving on, the next question is for Professor Rajib Shaw. So, sir, the question is, moving forward, should disaster risk reduction framework remain non-binding, or should they become binding international law? And if so, are there certain elements that should become binding?
Thank you, Jekulin. I think it's a very important point. It's very difficult to say yes or no. I will say, like, if I have a choice, maybe 70% for yes and 30% for no. And let me tell you that why it is like that. Definitely a binding agreement provides lots of legal weightage to that particular framework, and that actually helps the government to make what Takeya-san also pointed out, more proactive steps, more focus more on the resilient investment type of thing. So that's possibly the good part if it is a binding thing. But as we all know that we have been seeing the Paris Agreement and or like what has been the fate, and it's very much politically sort of determined. So when we have a binding agreement, that the negotiation and the whole political process behind that becomes, I think, too complex, and sometimes possibly the other stakeholders become more as an activist rather than participants. So what we see the more as a climate activist like that. So, and that's why my 30% reservation for that it should not be a binding agreement. But I think that beyond 2030, I strongly believe that there should not be different agreements like that SDG or disasters or climate change. There should be one global agreement which covers all different elements. And at least after 2030, that would be my hope, that it should be one global binding agreement which incorporates all the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us your insights. And I hope hearing from Professor Takaya and from you, the young professionals and the youth have learned a lot, and we can work thinking about the future of disaster. So it was a pleasure having both of you in today's webinar. So I'm Jekulin. So thank you all for being with us for the first session of today's webinar. So with this, I would hand over to Afifa. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for Professor Rajib Shaw, Professor Kimio Takeya, and Mrs. Jekulin for the amazing, insightful, interactive session. So amazing. So next, moving to the second session, feature thinking on DRR, which will be moderated by Dr. Sachi Suzuki from UNESCO. Dr. Sachi from UNESCO, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Afifa, for your introduction. I just would like to check with the team. Shall we play the introductory video first? If so, Payama, please play the video so that we will give some information on activities which involved organization have been doing.
Okay, Sachi. Mari perhatikan keadaan di sekitarmu. Apa yang kamu lihat? Mari perhatikan keadaan di sekitarmu. Apa yang kamu lihat? Terdapat banyak inovasi yang sudah ada di Indonesia, namun negara kita tidak luput dari masalah yang beragam. Banyak kebijakan dan program pembangunan yang diupayakan untuk menanggapi berbagai isu yang ada di lapangan. Namun, apakah itu cukup untuk menciptakan perubahan yang menyeluruh dan mencapai tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan? Untuk perubahan yang berarti bagi semua orang, termasuk kelompok rentan dan mencapai kesetaraan gender, kita perlu pendekatan yang berbeda.
Oke, bagaimana kita bisa melakukan itu?
Dengan belajar dan melakukan aksi bersama, itulah semangat yang dibawa oleh Badan Program Pembangunan Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa melalui Lab Akselerasi atau Accelerator Lab.
Apa bedanya dengan kegiatan yang ada saat ini?
Accelerator Lab merupakan jejaring belajar dari UNDP Global, satu dari 91 lab di 115 negara yang mencoba untuk mengatasi tantangan yang mempengaruhi kehidupan orang banyak.
Lalu, apa artinya untuk Indonesia?
Berhubung di Indonesia banyak sekali solusi inovatif yang sudah ada di masyarakat, kami menggunakan kesempatan ini untuk memahami masalah mendasar yang ada di baliknya.
Oh, jadi bukan sebagai penyedia solusi ya, tapi sebagai pencari solusi yang sudah ada?
Betul, dari pemetaan solusi-solusi lokal ini ada beberapa cara untuk melahirkan aksi seperti menginspirasi budaya inovasi sosial dalam kebijakan pemerintah, melakukan tes apakah solusi dapat menghasilkan manfaat lebih besar, mendorong gotong royong dan membentuk jaringan di antara penggiat solusi, serta membuka diskusi mengenai kebutuhan yang belum terpenuhi oleh solusi yang ada.
Oke, paham. Jadi memang fokusnya untuk mencari solusi dan mengembangkannya ya. Tapi bagaimana kalau yang ada hanya masalah dan belum ada solusinya?
Accelerator Lab Indonesia juga mencoba membawa pendekatan inovatif dalam memahami isu tertentu, misalnya dengan melihat tren dan pola yang berkembang, siapa saja potensi mitra yang relevan, dan melakukan eksperimen untuk pembelajaran. Tapi kami butuh bantuan kamu dan masyarakat Indonesia sebagai bagian dari komunitas yang terus berinovasi.
Wow, aku tertarik untuk berkontribusi.
UNSPAR Alliance is a network of youth and young professionals working in science, engineering, technology, and innovation.
UNSPIRE Alliance provides the platform for youth and young professionals to connect, engage, and learn from other youth and experts in the region.
We are not only at the international conferences or at the laboratories. UNSPIRE is working together with the local community in the field.
To participate in decision-making, demonstrating their ability for advocacy, communication, and consultation, as well as leveraging advanced technology.
We strongly believe that inclusivity is the integral factor of DDR. Hence, all our work and projects are people-centric and from the communities on the ground.
We are committed to supporting youth leadership. We are happy to work with the UNSPIRE Alliance.
UNSPIRE Alliance bridges the gap between professionals and young specialists and make it possible to exchange knowledge and experience between Asian countries to make them more resilient.
We work with youth and the young professionals from the academe and the industry sectors to build back better in a post-pandemic world.
UNSPIRE has connected us and bring us together to contribute for disaster risk reduction and climate change by utilizing science, engineering, technology, and innovation.
The future does not exist, yet we use it every day. We predict, dream, and fear. We plan, organize, and make decisions based on the future. Yet we know very little about how to use the future. Futures literacy is the capability that gives us insight into how we anticipate the future and allows us to unlock our potential to create and innovate. By training students, teachers, and professionals in futures literacy, we equip them with the skills they need to make sense of complexity, take advantage of change, and embrace uncertainty. In an increasingly interconnected world, they become the agents of change we need. How can we use the future? The future will never exist in the present. Our anticipations, plans, dreams, and fears are based on assumptions, on things we take for granted. When we plan and strategize, we often overlook the things that matter to us most. By revealing and examining these assumptions, we open ourselves up to many different futures. This leads to better informed decisions and innovative ideas. In short, we use the future to innovate the present. Futures literacy.
Okay, thank you very much for videos, Payama. So now we would like to move on to the second session. Second session is about the future thinking on DRR. In this session, the speakers will introduce new ways of thinking and how we can use the future in the context of disaster risk reduction and our collaborative activities on the future thinking of DRR in 2021 and 22. We will have presentations from 3 speakers, followed by a brief Q&A sessions. First, we would like to hear from Mr. Bas Luth, Lead Learning Designer of Accelerator Lab Network, UNDP. He will present on accelerating learning through new ways of thinking. Mr. Bas, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Sachi. And also thanks for inviting me. Let me share my screen. And I do hope that you can see my screen now. Right, there's loads to discuss. I mean, talking about the Accelerator Labs, we've been here for 2 years now, but I think there's a whole host of things and experiences that we can share. But let me kind of first start with, I think this quote came from Kat Tully, who's leading on the Futures Institute in the UK. And I always kind of find this an interesting way of kind of thinking about the future, that often the way we kind of think about it is that tomorrow or the future is very similar like today, as today is very similar to yesterday. And although this kind of webinar is about the futures, I actually want to focus a little bit more on the present, on today, and in particular how we think about how we perceive today and how we think about the present. Because I think this is about how we embrace its complexities, which will also help us to shape our futures in that sense. And I think this kind of, if you take this quote, I mean, it's often kind of true if things are fairly stable. But I think where we are now, we are in an era where I would say things are very unstable. And I think the COVID crisis that kind of started a year and a half ago is testament of that. That almost kind of shattered this whole idea that tomorrow will be very similar like today. It's very unpredictable what tomorrow might look like. And even while I would say we're getting used to dealing with the crisis in whatever way, I don't think we can assume that tomorrow will be very similar like it was a year ago. Although some people do hope that it's the case. But I think one of the things that this crisis has shown is that once we are confronted with a crisis, that we can learn incredibly fast and remodel our thinking incredibly quickly. And if you look at the vaccines that have been developed under a year and were also distributed in a very short amount of time, it kind of shows that we can do things very quickly. Interestingly, and it's also a point I will make later when I talk about the adjacent possible, is that the vaccines were developed based on technology and knowledge that was already there. So I think it's also important to consider that this COVID crisis is not a one-off, something that just happened once. I think if you kind of take a step back and kind of look at things that the kind of many crises that we see in climate, in human rights, in politics, in finance, in technologies, it's actually, I see it more like a web of crises, interconnected crises. It's not a one-off, and once we're done with it, life goes on. And in a way, that this kind of web of crises, it accelerates the pace of change of these kind of challenges or development challenges specifically at an increasing speed and with an increasing level of complexity and uncertainty. The current approaches that we use, and let's say the 20th century institutions that we use to tackle these challenges, I believe are not entirely fit to purpose to battle them. And we see an increasing gap. And although we're making progress, but we're certainly not doing that fast enough. So the accelerator labs are, let's say, an attempt to adapt to these 21st century challenges. And they're basically part within UNDP of a broader palette of other initiatives where we actually try to deal with complexity and uncertainty in a more in a better way. So, and I think this is kind of a question that I ask myself every day since I started working with the accelerator labs. So how do we deal with these exponential levels of complexity and uncertainty? And how do we adapt to that accelerating pace of change? So one of the things that we try to do is actually by learning faster and creating more actionable knowledge about not only how we understand the problems, but also the opportunities we see to well, not to solve them, but to find better ways of dealing with them. And by actionable knowledge, I mean knowledge that we can immediately use. So it's not writing a lot of fancy reports, but actually stuff that we can put into action immediately. And in order to do that, I think to learn faster and to deal with that complexity, I believe we need very different ways of thinking, which is kind of illustrated by these learning loops developed by Jeff Morgan. So if you look at the first loop, and this is kind of a loop you might be familiar with. This is something we do almost kind of on a daily basis, and often even unconsciously, even whether we're kind of improving a recipe or when we're evaluating a project. It basically, the first learning loop is about reflecting on our actions and thoughts, and kind of see how we can make small improvements. But if at some point we actually realize that small improvement or incremental improvements does not help us to actually make progress, we usually try to challenge our models of thinking, our mental models, or the kind of frames that we use, how we perceive the world. And this is generally a little bit harder. This is a bit more challenging to do that. And even if that fails, then, as Jeff Morgan says, we need to rethink how we think in science that might be framed as kind of using a new paradigm in that sense. And that's not easy, because this is really, really challenging, because much of our thinking is kind of deeply ingrained, and changing that, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. But I think there are ways of doing that. And that's also what we try to do with the Accelerator Labs, to introduce these new ways of thinking. But most importantly, I think this is also very much about how we reflect on how we think, which I will get back to later. So I think when we look at the nature of these challenges that we're talking about, and I mean, there are different ways of how you can categorize problems. They can be simple, complicated, complex. Some people might call it wicked, or there might be a crisis. They all have their distinct features. I think when you talk about simple and complicated problems, which often kind of have a number of elements included, and the more elements included, the more complicated things get, they would broadly go under the category of technical problems. And the mindset we use to solve technical problems is where we often assume that the world is stable, ordered, and that outcomes can be predicted. So, for example, if your car breaks down, your engine is not working, you can, through analysis, you can figure out what's wrong with your engine. And if it's the motor management system, you just fix that motor management system and you're able to drive again. However, on the other end, when we talk about adaptive complex problems, things are very, very different. And this is a space where the world is unstable and unordered, and elements are interconnected in a way that we do not always understand, often in hindsight, but not beforehand. So, and this is also a space where planning usually does not work. And in development, planning is a very dominant way of working. But actually, where we have to work with emergence, and that's really, really challenging. It's really challenging not only the kind of way we think, but also the way we work in that sense. So it's learning from things that happen when we interact with a system and when we do interventions and probe that system. So, and what doesn't work here is to, if you figure out that what's wrong, to fix that, and that will change the entire system. That's not the case. So, for example, if you want to if you want to resolve a traffic jam in your city, then fixing your motor management of your car is certainly not going to solve that problem. And that's kind of often the approach that I see, is that the problems that we try to fix are very complex in nature, but the mindsets and the ways of thinking that we use to address them are more from, let's say, the technical order. And they're technically, I believe, incompatible. So talking about mindsets, and although the title of this talk is about thinking, but I think we should go beyond thinking. And mindsets, in my view, are a constellation that are grounded in beliefs and attitudes and worldviews that shape how we perceive the world, how we see things, that shape how we think about the world. And this is almost kind of how we create some sort of cause and effects models in our minds that help us predict certain future states of what the world might look like. So, I mean, your mental model of traffic in your city might be that there is some sort of certain pattern of it, that kind of in the early mornings, there might be a lot of traffic and traffic jams. And in the late afternoon, the kind of same thing. So that allows you to anticipate and respond to that and act. And if you don't want to get stuck in a traffic jam, you decide either to work from home or to choose a different time to do your commute. So mindsets, in my view, are that collection of beliefs, how we see things, how we think about the world, and how we act in it. It's not only about thinking. All these three things go together. So, and I think how the present relates to the future in that sense is that if how we perceive the present largely determines also how we envisage the future and how we act upon these views. So I don't want to kind of make this too theoretical, but I'm kind of showing a lot of diagrams. My apologies for that, but it's just to bear this in mind, that this is not just about thinking, this is also about seeing and acting. So very brief introduction about the Accelerator Labs. It's actually, if you kind of call this some sort of a theory of change, what we actually try to do is by strengthening certain capabilities and, let's say, introducing new mindsets into the organization, we hope to accelerate learning. And by accelerating learning, we actually mean making new meaning, tapping into different inputs, engaging with other stakeholders that we normally do not work with, and learn from them and learn with them. Ultimately, to become smarter together. And that's what we call collective intelligence. And that's a key method to how we work. And we believe if we can learn faster about the world and create better actionable knowledge, then we will also be able to adapt to that change and accelerate implementing the Agenda 2030. We're a network of 91 labs, as you've just seen in the movie, operating in about 115 countries. But you might also consider this almost like a big mind, where it's not these labs working in isolations, but where we also connect them in various different ways, enabling the labs to learn from and with each other. The labs are also set up, they're basically one big experiment, as we say it. And each lab in itself is an experiment. So the idea is that we do not have a cookie cutter approach where every lab is exactly the same. Instead, we build on this idea, as our administrator, Akim Steiner, said at the beginning, let 1,000 flowers bloom. So all these labs find different ways of figuring out how to make change in the world, all based on some sort of common principles, of course, but we're really curious to learn from this diversity and variety of all these flowers that are blooming. So just very briefly, how do we learn as a network, and how do we learn as an organization. Now, let me take you back to the very early beginning. That's almost 3 years ago, when my colleagues, Glenn and Millie, were drafting the blueprint for the Accelerator Labs. And they looked at this diagram, which shows an overview of a lot of innovation methods and approaches that are available. And they had 2 questions in mind. What methods have an overlap with others? But more importantly, what methods give us an immediate sense of today rather than yesterday? And to illustrate this, I was 2 years ago when I just joined the Accelerator Labs, I was in Senegal, and I was talking to some colleagues. And one of them said, it's actually funny. What we do, we spend 2 years of planning to create a plan that looks 5 years ahead into the future. And we do that based on 10-year-old data. And she said, in our country, things change every 3 months. So, and it kind of illustrated how planning can be, or the ways of working that we kind of normally adhere to can be very disconnected from what reality actually looks like. And for that very reason is also why my colleagues put this idea of how can we make sense of the presence in a better way, rather than kind of better understanding the past. And as I said, the present this is not only about the present, because the present is also a stepway into the future. So, and I think this is also illustrated with the by the idea of the adjacent possible, was coined by Stephen Johnson. The adjacent possible is basically, it's a shadow future that is already out there. And this is not only about, let's say, the weak signals that we see of what the future is there, but most interestingly, when we look at the adjacent possible, which is basically in the present, we also see solutions or opportunities that we are not aware of. But our eyes are not always kind of trained to see them. So we need to retrain our eyes actually to see these solutions that are out there. So, and this is also in terms of methods that we use. There is a whole host of methods we use, but 3 of them are key. One is what we call solutions mapping. And I think this was also mentioned by Marco earlier, is that the best place to prepare for disasters is to learn from how communities are actually solving their problems. And that's the whole idea of solutions mapping, is see how people are solving their everyday problems. And this is not only about understanding these solutions, but it also allows us to identify unaddressed or unmet needs that no one has on their radar yet. And as I already mentioned, collective intelligence is a very important key method. And I mean, there are different ways of how you might define collective intelligence design. But I think in general, it's something about becoming smarter together by bringing groups of diverse people together, but also how we use data, and particularly real-time data and technology, to augment our cognitive capabilities. And I see collective intelligence as a large overarching method that covers many other kind of methods. Bit of a third method we also have is what we call a portfolio of experiments. I won't go into a lot of details right now, but it's basically how we probe systems with multiple interventions and kind of actually see what effects are generated and whether they're desirable or not. I'm kind of running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to cut a few things short. But just to illustrate a few examples from the labs, to give a few examples that illustrate this way of working, in particular, this kind of collective intelligence way of working. So in Uganda, for example, what they did is they convened various different stakeholders and involved what I would say the very unusual suspects. So normally you would kind of invite governments and law enforcement and all these things, but they also brought into the room the illegal wood loggers when they were discussing deforestation. And this is about exploring multiple perspectives. But interestingly, this also allowed them to create almost what I would call a learning ecosystem, who are running their experiments and orchestrate these experiments together. In the Ukraine, there's a really interesting example where they used real-time data about illegal waste burning, and that was causing a lot of air pollution. And by using real-time satellite imagery, it actually enabled communities to see how bad the problem actually was. So it's the idea of kind of feeding it back to the system. So this is not using data in an extractive way, but this is actually to empower people. In Vietnam, ethnographic research, they did studies trying to understand how informal waste pickers, what their everyday lives look like. But actually what they learned from that is that these people had kind of figured out some sort of what we might call an informal circular economy. So while governments try to foster such kind of circular economies, at the grassroots level, people have already kind of figured it out. So what can we learn from that? So these are just quickly a few examples to illustrate how we use these methods, and which are basically designed to kind of really challenge the way we think and the way we work. If there was something I would like to leave you with here, I mean, it's we had a lot of talks already, and there is always a bit of a question. So, what can I do today? Where can we start with? And I think when we talk about learning, we often do a lot of action, but I think we do not always take the time or create the space for some real proper reflection, where we really start to rethink how we think and start to ask questions that really challenge ourselves, not in the way we work, but also in the way we think about things. So that big reflection, I feel, is often kind of missing, and we do not often create the opportunity or the space to sit down and reflect. We might do that individually, or we might do that with a team, perhaps occasionally. But I believe there's a lot of value in doing that in a much more deliberate way. I mean, I worked with quite a lot of governments in my career, and what always surprised me in the many workshops that I ran, when we were doing reflection exercises, then people often said, "Oh, this is actually brilliant. We need to do this more often." But actually, we do not consider reflection as being part of our job. And that always kind of puzzled me. How can you solve really, really complex problems if you do not take time to reflect? So to give a bit of a hint or some guidance what that might look like, and also going back to the 3 learning loops of Jeff Morgan, I mean, you can start at a very easy level and ask yourself, so what kind of results are our current ways of thinking and action creating, and what might we need to do to improve things? But you can also really go up, levels up, and I mean, these are questions that we're asking ourselves at the global level, like how do we construct meaning, or how do we create knowledge, and what determines truth? I'm conscious that these questions can sound quite philosophical, but they can. I think if we really want to push the boundaries and accelerate on these large development challenges that we have, we should push ourselves a little bit harder on these things and these questions. So I guess we'll share all the slides and all the materials. So you will also have an opportunity to go through them afterwards. As for now, thank you very much. And I would like to hand back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bass. It was very, very insightful presentations and on how we see the world, how we perceive the world, and how we act from those perceptions. And thank you for highlighting potential reflections, which will be connected to, I guess, next presentation from Dr. Riel Miller. So now I would like to invite Dr. Riel Miller, Head of Futures Literacy, UNESCO headquarters. He will introduce the Futures Literacy. Thank you, Dr. Riel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, Sachi. Hello, everybody. Very, very glad to be here. A real privilege and learning a lot. I heard from Mr. Shaw, from Rajib, he spoke about governance changes and community-based approaches, and Mr. Saikia spoke about vulnerability and fragility and investing in disaster risk reduction, and Bass asked us how we can rethink the way we think. Let me start with what I believe my good friend Jeff agrees with me about, which is that we actually have a fundamental paradigmatic problem, meaning the very important questions that have been posed here, and I think it does have to do with how we construct meaning and how we rethink the way we think. I would say the fundamental obstacle to that, and something that is very difficult, precisely because it's paradigmatic, and just to unpack that term a little bit, it's, paradigmatic change is the kind of change that we talk about when we say, we used to think the world was flat, and now, for a variety of reasons, we think the earth is round. This is very difficult for us to actually do, to make that kind of paradigmatic change. There's a contradiction between one way of looking and the other way of looking and seeing. And the kinds of fears and the kinds of hopes that are constructed based on one paradigm versus another paradigm are significantly different. And this makes paradigmatic change and paradigmatic transition really very difficult, because our nursery rhymes, our stories, our myths built up on one paradigm don't really work and don't really allow us to understand the other paradigm. And one of the ways, though, of relating to this that's quite, I think, approachable and natural is to just think of children as they grow, and the paradigms that they're obliged to work with and to change. And I'll take a very simple one, which relates to the topic, I think, which is central here, which is determinism and planning and agency. In other words, our sense of actionability, our practical side of doing things, of wanting to influence. And a child starts testing the world around them, and they use very causal frameworks. They want to get fed, they cry, they want to do something that adults do, like, let's say, crossing the street, and they need to learn to anticipate the cars so that they don't get killed. And they learn what we would call these basic ability to use our imagination, because it's not something that's already happened, and many times we don't want it to happen, which is we want to prepare and not be taken by surprise. We use what we call anticipatory systems. Now, it turns out that anticipatory systems, the capacity to integrate time, anticipation, is the only way that the future exists in the present. Because we all know you can't go to the future. The future does not exist. We can't observe it. We can't describe it by seeing it or looking at it. So the challenge is to be able to understand, for humans, because this is our primary anticipatory system, how our imagination functions, how our imagination builds up our approach to seeing the world. The future is this incredibly powerful force. It enables us to do many, many things that are essential for our survival, but also for finding meaning. Because the future, our expectations, what we imagine, also has to do with our sense of worth, our sense of success, what we fear. And so understanding, pardon me, how our imagination works is a very crucial part of relating to the world around us. And what has dominated, what has been so pervasive in so much of human civilization, it's been this desire to know the future, to be known for knowing the future, to be a sage, to be a prophet, to be a predictor. And also, in a way that seems to me to be immature, and I'll come back to this maturity side of it, a desire to impose our will on the future. So a child, as they grow, they move from this phase in which they're testing determinism to testing causality, and they move into a phase where all of a sudden that simplicity, which is something that we assume will be the case, that when we drop something, it will fall, that things will repeat. That simplicity gives way to ambiguity. And as an adolescent, how do I establish a relationship with a friend? What's the future of my love life? What will I do as a career? How will I feel confident and secure? Here, the anticipatory systems, the imagination, moves into a very different situation. It's one where uncertainty becomes important. And I would say, going back then to the civilizations that build monuments and want to impose on the future. So, you know, whether it's a pyramid in Egypt or a pyramid in Mexico or a pyramid in another part of the world, where we try the Colosseum in Rome or the Great Wall in China, the Imperial City, we build these monuments and we think, okay, the world's become ambiguous and confusing and uncertain. What can we do to impose? What can we do to go back to the childhood, the immature view of the way to approach the world? How can we subject everything that happens to a human intentional planning, human intentional control? And I think that in this way, humanity has fundamentally alienated itself, separated itself, isolated our capabilities in a paradigm where complexity, not as something that's more or less. Complexity is not something you dial up or dial down. Things can be more or less complicated, absolutely. Like a chess game is more complicated than hopscotch. But the universe we live in, regardless of what you do, whether you're doing something simple or doing something more complicated, is complex, meaning it is continuously emergent, continuously full of novelty, constantly surprising us. So the challenge becomes, from a paradigmatic perspective, from the perspective of how to rethink the way we think, can we really fundamentally integrate complexity? And my contention would be, and here's where futures literacy plays a fundamental role, that in order to achieve the goals of better governance, in order to achieve the goal of addressing vulnerability and fragility, in order to achieve the goal of being more aware and able to understand emergence, we fundamentally need to go beyond the planning perspective. We need to understand that if we use the future in order to say, how can I be more safe tomorrow? If we use the future to say, how can I be more effective at doing what I'm already doing? That we actually truncate, we actually cripple a crucial part of our capacity to be improvisational. And here's the crux of the matter. Planning is not improvisation by definition. Improvisation is not planning. And the question becomes, how can we get better at improvisation. We're already very powerful at planning, and we're already very powerful at thinking, well, what can I do now? What improvement, what innovation, what collective intelligence can I apply to the current situation in order to make it better? And that's crucial. It's about reform, it's about adaptation. But how do we put ourselves in a mode where we integrate in transition, where we integrate in something that's absolutely fundamental to a complex emergent universe, which is death? Things end, things get destroyed. We cannot always prevent the end of things. And furthermore, something which looked safe and like it would not end at one moment can become very vulnerable and fragile at another moment. And there's no way to know. And it's an unintended consequence, climate change being the perfect example. But these things happen in a way that is difficult to make sense of and integrate, to rethink. We can't rethink it if we don't start from the proposition that it's impossible to rethink emergent novelty. What is possible is to become better at sensing and making sense of emergent novelty. And in that sense, being improvisational. And the crucial step in becoming better at being improvisational is to really use the future in a fundamentally different way than anticipation for the future. Anticipation for the future says, I'm imagining the future, I'm thinking about the future, which is so powerful and such a great influence on our hopes and our fears and our motivations and our despair, those images of the future. I'm thinking about it not just in terms of what I can do to create the future, make the future, control the future, colonize tomorrow, but I'm using the future to disturb, to give up on that control, to give up on what I know, to abandon the dictionary of the past, to abandon even what I think I can name in the present, and to do the very hard thing, really quite hard, from where we are today, because I think we're, in a sense, our capability, we are futures illiterate, to be much more sensitive, being able to sense and make sense of novelty and emergence, things we cannot name, which includes the willingness to embrace things that are potentially not permanent, not durable, that we don't know whether they'll be the beginning of something big or nothing at all, which has to do with the meaning of ephemerality, which is recovering in the context of destruction, birth and death, the full meaning of what it's like, the experience of living in a complex universe. So having laid that foundation, if I may, and I think it's completely complementary in the same way that capabilities are always complementary in the sense that they give you the capacity with all of the things we've heard so far, and the tremendous and laudable ambitions of the frameworks of the accelerator labs is something that is fundamentally empowered and given, I think, a much more complexity compatible starting point, positioning, is the ability to use anticipation more effectively. And here where what UNESCO, from the point of view of human knowledge, has been trying to do over the last almost decade now, is to point out that we actually have very diverse anticipatory systems. That the way in which we integrate the future into our thinking is very diverse, and that we can become much more empowered from the point of view of understanding where our images of the future come from, how our images of the future are created, and in that way become able to use the future in different ways for different reasons. And it's this capability that is critical, I think, for disaster risk reduction, for being able to address the ambition of the accelerator labs to have this kind of agility and inventiveness in real time. The good news is that, as I was saying, we all use our anticipatory systems all the time. These are things that are tacit. They're kind of we just don't pay attention, and it's really very inspiring in many ways to think about reading and writing, where we know that the human capability of using language could be augmented through reading and writing. In the same way, the basic human capability of anticipation can be augmented through futures literacy and integrated in to all of the things we've heard about today in a way which would, I think, overcome this paradigmatic gap, this dualism between the world where we try to plan and where we make assumptions related to things remaining the same, and a world in which we are open to improvisation and using novelty as a resource, so that change becomes not a threat, but a contribution to creativity and diversification. And by putting us in touch with birth and death, by putting us in touch with diversification, being able to embrace complexity through the openness of anticipation for emergence, actually builds an adaptation approach which goes beyond adaptation. And we all know that there's mitigation, adaptation, transformation in the current discussions around climate change. And the issue around transformation is one that is still very, very difficult for us to understand, I think precisely because we handicap our understanding of transformation. We think we must know transformation in advance. No, that's the planning way of thinking. Transformation is unknowable in advance. What we can do is we can make ourselves more able to let go of the fears of endings, the fears of change, the fears of destruction, and understand that in the context that we live in, we are continuously creating, there's continuous birth and death. Futures literacy laboratories, which are a tool, and futures literacy, I want to point out, is not a method, it's a capability. Look, there's a method. Reading and writing has a tool, the alphabet, words, grammar. But you don't say that somebody has really understood the capacity to read and write if they just know the alphabet and words. They need to be able to understand the different uses, the way in which reading and writing change their perception of the world. They need to become capable of understanding that it can be used for poetry, not just for laundry lists and for writing down blueprints. And so this capability that's futures literacy that can be developed using many different methods, but which is very accessible because everybody has access to their anticipatory assumptions, is I think, a significant element, component of all the things we're talking about. And many of you know that we've been running futures literacy laboratories as one way, one technique for building people's capabilities around thinking about anticipation for the future and anticipation for emergence. And we're very obviously grateful and enthusiastic to work very closely with colleagues, UNDRR, we're currently working with UNDP and many others. I do hope that despite the fact that it seems often a bit strange, which is normal if it's paradigmatic change, it should seem strange. But despite the fact that it seems strange, and takes us outside our, in some senses, our comfort zone, because it calls upon us to look at the world, to construct our sense of security, our sense of agency differently. Even though it's uncomfortable to do that, I do hope that we can do that all together. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for a very interesting introduction of the futures literacy. It seems like we need to really go beyond the planning, and also there are a lot of things like improvisation, anticipatory system that we can learn from now on. So now I would like to move on to next speaker. Sorry that we are running out of time, but very briefly, I would like to invite a third speaker, Ms. Nurul Sri Rahati Tias from UU Inspire Alliance, who will introduce our upcoming collaborations. Nurul, floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope you are still with me right now. Today I'd like to explain more about the activities about future thinking on the UNDRR resilience. This year, UNSPAR Alliance is honored to have opportunity to collaborate with UNESCO Jakarta, UNDP Indonesia, and UNDRR, organize a series of activities on future thinking on disaster risk reductions and resilience, consisting of series of activities such as webinar, future literacy lab, and Let's Talk DRR. The output of this activity is publications on youth and young professionals in Asia and the Pacific to think about the future of disaster risk reductions and resilience in 2045. By 2045, for two reasons, it is 50 years after the first World Conference on DRR. Second, it is 30 years after the last World Conference on DRR. Third, it is 24 years from now, and by then, current youth and young professionals will be between 41 to 64 years old, expected to be in leadership positions. As Mr. Marco has also highlighted, that is why engagement of youth and young professionals is essential. So we can think together on thinking on how to save more life together toward the future. This publication is planned to launch at GPDRR 2022 in Bali, Indonesia. During this activity, we will use the future literacy term. The concept of future literacy was pioneered by Dr. Liu Miral, which we are blessed to have the person himself today. Future literacy is a capacity to know how to image the future and why it is necessary. Future literacy enables us to become aware of the sources of our hope and fear and improve our ability to harness the power of image of the future. I have learned a lot from Dr. Liu during future thinking preparation and simulations, and today's inspiring talk. The challenge is to use our imagination functions feeling to deal with uncertainties of the future. And excited to dive more in future thinking of disaster risk reductions and resilience. The objective of future thinking on disaster risk reductions and resilience are introduce the latest advance, develop competencies, build capacity, and facilitate youth and young professionals' thought and voice on the future of DRR and resilience. Ms. Sophie and Mr. Bas also delivered a strong message reminding us to also think and anticipate the unknown, navigating the challenge and uncertainties, complexities, and crises that might come up in the future. The expected outcome from this initiative would be that the youth and young professionals be able to understanding and have skill on future literacy through learning by doing. Secondly, they are energized and able to innovate in achieving future of DRR and resiliency. And certainly, the interesting new ideas, concepts, and models developed for DRR and resiliency to be shared worldwide on the global platform in Bali next year. We are now here in 2021, 25 years after the first global framework on the Yokohama Principle for the Safer World in 1994, 27 years to be exact. We take this timeline to reflect and learn how was the progress of DRR in the last 25 or 27 years. As we learn from Professor Rajib and Professor Keio in their insightful talk. Professor Rajib also teach us the complex detailed process of this timeline graphic during his talk, from the 10 principles of the Yokohama strategy to the Hyogo framework for action in 2005, and finally the Sendai framework for disaster risk reductions in 2015, and other global agendas such as SDGs until 2030. Professor Keio has provided insightful learning on how to advocate based on science on DRR and climate change in line with other global agenda over time, including plan to harmonize COVID-19 with traditional DRR effort. As youth and young professionals, we feel the important and need to think about how we are going to take part in navigating the next 25 years. This provides a similar timeline to reflect 25 years back and think 25 years to the future. Insightful GT from Professor Rajib, governments, education, and technology to the future. and strong message from Professor Tetea to investment. Today, investment will be part of the future. Will there be any new change? Will we able to save more life? Could we catch up social innovation in line with speed of technology innovation? Will science and technology humanize to the ground level and be inclusive? And importantly, raised by Mr. Bas, how do we deal with exponential level of complexity, uncertainty, and accelerating pace of change? That's why we need to discuss and engage in future things related to DRR and resilience, and shape our perspective and develop collective intelligence with the landscape on innovation in front of us. This is our timeline. Today is the first webinar. Next month, we'll continue with the Future Literacy Lab in 3 different topics. Between each lab, we will have Let's Talk DRR, and the end of the activity, we will have our second webinar. The objective of first webinar sessions is to reminisce and discuss what was envisions in the past about the present disaster risk reduction and resiliency, and introduce the future thinking of DRR activities in 2021 and 2022. The objective of second webinar session is to share the overall result of the lab and Let's Talk DRR and get input from experts. And hopefully we can organize a third webinar in 2022, if possible, with the third Youth and Young Professionals for DRR Asia Pacific Regional Workshop, back-to-back with DPDRR 22. Future Literacy Lab for DRR objective are capacity building by learning by doing, engage youth and young professional system thinking and collective intelligence process, discuss one DRR topic, identify youth and young professional champions, and lesson learned to be published on DPDRR publications. Let's Talk DRR objective are to share the result, to get additional insight and talk from experts, to share the expert of the participants, and produce Let's Talk DRR report. In short, this is the overview of our programs, which started with the webinars, hands-on activities through the lab, and share the insight in Let's Talk DRR. Quoting from Mr. Bas, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Can't wait to see you again in the next event and walking the journey together. Before I end, here's the list of the core team from UNESCO Jakarta, UNDP Indonesia, UNDRR, and Inspiring Alliance. Thank you very much, and back to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nurul, for introducing very exciting the future plans of this initiative. I'd like to briefly introduce questions and address this to the speakers. So first question is to Mr. Bas. Since you mentioned about in 21st century, we have different challenges and then we need a different way of approaching those. So the question is, will the current thinking be obsolete in the future, or will it remain relevant with some modifications and innovations? Please provide a brief answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Sachi. No, I think it's a very good question. I think what we usually tend to do is when we observe that one way of thinking does not work, we argue for replacing it with another one. And that's almost kind of like a natural mechanism. I think Hegel described this idea of thesis, antithesis, and ultimately coming to some sort of synthesis. This is a similar idea. It's where there is A, there is B, but ultimately, I think things will converge into a more blend of different ways of working. So I don't believe that the current ways of thinking and working will be fully replaced. I see that some of it is really valuable and there is a good reason why we have them. But I think as Real already mentioned, I mean, we are really powerful in certain ways of working and thinking, and particularly in planning. But we also have to train that muscle to become more skillful in kind of being more improvisational and working with uncertainty and ambiguity. So I see it more like a balance. But so in order to create that balance, I believe we also sometimes have to push really hard for that new method. But it won't be a replacement. It will be more like a synthesis at the end.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bas, for your answer. Next question is related to Dr. Miller. What are the opportunities for futures literacy in the DRL and the resilience building space? Since you mentioned that, well, planning is something that has to be, updated. It's kind of it requires a new way to address, but the DLL is pretty much related to the planning. So it would be great if you could some advice on how this futures literacy can be useful.
Thank you. It's an important question, and it relates, I think, to the previous question and what Bas was talking about. I think that perhaps the metaphor that would, taking from the past, indeed, is a metaphor of walking on two legs or seeing with two eyes. And we all know that if you hop around on one leg, that leg will become very strong, and you'll become very agile and able to do many things with that one leg. But if you have two legs, you can do things that you could not do with just one. But there's another issue. Not only do you need to exercise the other leg that has been kind of atrophied, but you need to understand the relationship between the two of them. And since, in many ways, if I can caricature, humanity has been hopping around on one leg a great deal, and if we begin to exercise this other leg, we still have a great deal of work to do on negotiating the relationship and understanding the interaction between the two. And anybody who's watched a baby learning to walk understands that the brain is working this out. Oh, I have one leg, I have another leg. Now what do I do with them? What's balance? And obviously balance, if you're on a tightrope, is not balance if you're walking in the street. And so context and conditions make a big difference, and our acuity and our ability. So here, I think futures literacy's contribution to disaster risk reduction is that it doesn't say that planning is wrong, but that it says that if we perceive the world only through planning, we will not only make ourselves more fragile and vulnerable, but we will, in some senses, separate ourselves from one of the greatest resources we have, which is to take advantage of change. And I think that let me just point to one very beneficial attribute, which is true for all of the aspects: investment, governance reform, acceleration of innovation, is that it reduces our anxiety. It has to do with building confidence. And in fact, the idea of improvisation is not necessarily to go faster or to be cleverer, somehow smarter. It's really to be more open, more aware, and through that awareness, have the confidence that when the unknown emerges, which it always will, when it emerges, I am better able to sense it and make sense of it, because I'm not locked in to doing things so that I can repair, solve, fix quickly the world around me, but rather, as my friend Bio will say, times are urgent, let's slow down.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Thanks to Mr. Bass and Dr. Miller. I hope that the participants had a clearer view on how we can utilize the future, especially in the context of disaster risk reduction. So now, as a last question, I would like to ask Ms. Nurul, since maybe the participants, most of them are youth and young professionals, what can we expect if we join this a series of activity which you have introduced?
Yeah, I think the first is we will get the interesting lesson learned. Of course, we can learn more about from related to the future thinking, and we can hear more about future thinking from real maybe next time in the lab. So from my previous experiments, we have very interesting sessions during the simulation. So we can start thinking about what we we think about the futures, and then we start to thinking about what happened today. We will back to this year, and then we also discussing about what will happen in the future with the innovation on something. But yeah, I think this is very good lesson learned that we will get. So join with us.
Thank you very much. I hope that some of the participants can join us and join this learning by doing opportunity. Thank you very much for all the speakers. Now I would like to conclude the second session and hand over to Ms. Afifa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachi, Mr. Bas, and also Dr. Rio, Mrs. Nurul, for a wonderful session on future literacy and future DRR thinking. So we have reached the end of our session. Mr. Sufyan Aslam, as co-chair of the Inspire Alliance Assembly, will provide his closing remarks. So, Mr. Sufyan Aslam, please welcome.
Thank you very much, Afifa, for that. And for the interest of time, I'm gonna keep it short. And apologies for the background noise. I just prayer time here in Malaysia. So first and foremost, I would like to thank all of the speakers that we had today, starting with the first session with Professor Rajib and Professor Keio. I think certainly both of them provided an excellent historical lessons on DRR over the years, starting with 1984 up until this 2021. And certainly they have highlighted a lot of reframing processes and all the different changes in definitions and how we thought about disasters over the time. So I think as youth and young professionals, it is it is a good history lesson to be made. The second session was how we tied on with moving forward to the future. How do youth and young professionals change the way they think, and what are some of the methods that can be used, for anticipating and better planning for the future. And we have heard from Mr. Bas and also Dr. Rio, both of whom presented fascinating ideas and methods and processes and how we think and how we plan for the future. And both of the skills involve the reframing processes that sort of like allows us to think and anticipate better. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all of the audience who attended with us today. I know 2 hours is quite a time to invest in during these days, but I certainly hope that you have learned and gained a lot from today's sessions. I know I certainly have. And so you have heard from Nurul on the way forward. This is certainly not the last webinar that we will be organizing. We do have more webinars in the future and also future literacy labs as well. So we do look forward for your continuous contribution and your continuous support in our events. You can find all of the events available online on our Facebook page and on social media as well. So I would like to thank all of the collaborators for this project. UNESCO Office Jakarta, UNDP Accelerator Lab, UNDRR Asia Pacific, UNESCO Futures Literacy, Dr. Riel and his team. We have learned a lot when it comes to futures literacy, simulation, and also training on how we use. And certainly on behalf of UNSPIRE Alliance, it is a very fascinating time and a good opportunity for youth and young professionals to get this opportunity to learn and equip ourselves with new skills and new insights on how we can be better prepared for the future. And as mentioned by a lot of the speakers today, the youth are the leaders of the future, and certainly by engaging and being part of these events, we can certainly equip ourselves to be the future that these experts hope will be. So as on behalf of UNSPIRE Alliance and the organizing committee, thank you very much again to all of the speakers and all of the audiences today. And I hope you all have a good weekend, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thank you very much.